This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Conflict of Heroes Storms of Steel, the 3rd edition. Conflict of Heroes Storms of Steel was released in 2019 by Academy Games and designed by Uwe Eickart and Gunther Eickart. This game supports up to 4 players and takes from 1 to 4 hours to play. This is the next sequence of advanced rules for Conflict of Heroes Storms of Steel. This video will cover pages 23 through 27 of the rulebook for Hills and Elevation and Mortars and Artillery. This tutorial will prepare players to take on Mission 5, Pursuit from Solfkaz 158, and Mission 6, Sneak Attack. So if you've mastered all the rules from the previous videos in the series and you're ready for more, then let's get started. In this section, we're going to discuss elevation. Each map has topography and symbols that indicate the 3-dimensional contours of the environment. The edge of a hex that lists its coordinates will also indicate that space's elevation. There are 5 levels of elevation. Let's walk through each of them. The lowest levels of elevation are called balkas. Balkas are deep ravines created by floodwaters with steep rocky banks. Balka levels can be identified by inverted triangles pointing down next to a hex's coordinates. The deepest level is marked with an inverted double triangle and is called a level -2 balka. Rising above this is a level -1 balka with 1 inverted triangle. Once you've risen out of the balkas, then you're at level 0 or normal elevation, which will not have any triangles. Elevation that rises above normal levels are called hills. Hills can be identified by triangles pointing up. Making our ascent, there is a level 1 hill with 1 triangle. And above this is a level 2 hill with 2 triangles pointing up. All 5 of these geographic levels make up the game's elevation. Now, let's talk about elevation combat modifiers. If an attacker, or a target, occupies a higher level of elevation than their opponent, then they receive a bonus. If an attacker occupies the high ground, then they receive a +1 to their attack rating. Or, if the target occupies the high ground in relation to its attacker, then it receives a +1 to its defense rating. Traversing these levels may add action points to a unit's movement cost. Also be aware that hex spaces on the map do not always progress neatly from one level to the next. A normal level hex space at level 0 may butt up against a steep level 2 hill, or a deep level -2 balka. These steep inclines or declines may prevent some units from entering the hex space. Let's walk through some examples and I'll show you what I mean. When a unit moves from one level of terrain to the next level of terrain, it is considered to be traveling up a slope. When ascending into an adjacent hex that is 1 elevation level higher, the unit's movement cost increases by 1 action point. This cost increase occurs regardless of whether it is a foot unit, wheeled unit, or tracked unit. Whether the unit begins in a balka, normal, or hill level doesn't matter, as long as the hex that the unit is moving into only ascends 1 elevation level. However, when descending into an adjacent hex that is 1 elevation level lower, there is no penalty to the movement cost. Once again, this is regardless of whether it is a foot unit, wheeled unit, or tracked unit. Finally, one additional note regarding elevation. Even if the hex contains a road, this does not negate the movement cost modifiers from elevation. When a unit moves into an adjacent hex that is 2 elevation levels higher or lower, it is considered a steep terrain move. In this example, a hex containing level 0 terrain drops off abruptly to a level -2 balka below it. Whether ascending or descending this steep of terrain, foot units add +2 to their movement cost, and wheeled and tracked vehicles are prohibited altogether from entering. Finally, let's talk about cliffs. Cliffs are hexes adjacent to each other that are 3 elevations higher or lower. Foot units, wheeled units, and track units are all prohibited from moving into hex spaces with this severe level of elevation change. Some last notes on elevation regarding terrain, specifically small bulkheads and anti-tank ditches. These terrain spaces affect units in different ways. For foot units, small bulkheads and AT ditches add 2 points to the unit's movement cost when entering. When attacked across the small bulkhead bordering its hex, foot units receive a +1 to their defense rating bonus. Small bulkheads also grant foot units a -1 to their rally bonus. As for vehicles, whether they be wheeled or tracked, neither can cross a small bulkhead's hex side, and both cannot enter an anti-tank ditch. Keep these rules in mind when encountering terrain types with these units. Regarding elevation, the most challenging rules to grasp are those for line of sight. When a player looks down at a 2D map, they must be able to visualize the 3-dimensional elements of the environment. Confirming line of sight to a target can be difficult with hills, valleys, woods, and man-made structures, all of which may be at different levels. To clear up some of this ambiguity, let's walk through some examples, beginning with the plateau effect. In this example, the active unit is on a level 0 hex at the base of a series of plateaued hills. Looking up the hillside, let's see what enemy units are within line of sight. Each figure on a hex represents a unit. The green figures are within line of sight, and the red figures are not visible. This is due to the plateau effect. Essentially, units positioned on hexes farther back from the hill's edge cannot be seen. In simplistic 3D, this may seem obvious, but there is a rule to help players determine this in more ambiguous situations. First, determine the elevation of the attack hex and the target hex. Second, whichever is highest, mark as the high ground hex. Third, line of sight is established if no intervening hex or hexes is of equal or higher level than the high ground hex. In this example, there is an intervening hex and the level is equal to the target hex. Therefore, no line of sight can be established. This may still seem really obvious, but let's do one more. Our active figure in the attack hex is now going to target the edge of the level 2 hill. This hex now becomes the high ground hex. This time there are 2 intervening hexes. However, neither is equal to or greater than the high ground hex. As a result, line of sight can be established. One more example. If the attack hex now targets the farthest level 2 hex, the level of the high ground doesn't change. And now there are 3 intervening hexes. However, one intervening hex's level is equal to the high ground. Therefore, line of sight cannot be established. Keep these rules in mind because now we're going to move into some more complicated examples. Now, let's discuss another concept of line of sight and elevation called blind spots. This time, our active unit is positioned on a level 2 hill, which gives them the high ground. However, you'll also notice that there are hexes with woods and buildings on them. With these new elements in the terrain, let's see what our unit can see now. When determining line of sight to visible targets, terrain that obstructs view like woods or buildings is considered one elevation level higher than the hex it occupies. These hexes with woods and buildings will then create blind spot hexes directly behind them. A blind spot hex is never in line of sight regardless of the high ground hex's elevation. If an area of line of sight blocking terrain is multiple hexes wide, then each hex creates its own blind spot. This may create a blind area of contiguous hexes. With 5 levels of elevation and several obstructing terrain types, Keep these line of sight rules in mind to determine visibility on the battlefield. Now, let's look at an actual game board example and see if we can uncover all the blind spots. In this example, a German sniper has taken a shooting position at the top of a level 2 hill. From the sniper's position looking out east, we can see that there is a level 1 hill that creates a blind spot. Several of the woods hexes also create blind spots in the hex spaces directly behind them. However, farther down the tree line there is a woods hex that does not have a blind spot. Any units that enter this hex are a viable target. And to the south, the land makes a steep drop-off into several level -2 bulkas. Therefore, enemy units in these bulka hexes would be in blind spots and out of the sniper's line of sight. Hopefully, these examples have given you a better idea of how to identify blind spots in the game. In this section, we're going to discuss long-range weapons such as mortars and artillery. Let's begin by looking at mortar units. Mortar units are teams of 2 to 6 men that fire high explosive shells. While all mortar teams can fire directly at targets within their range and line of sight, some mortar teams can fire indirectly at targets they cannot see. Let's study the counter layout of the mortar units on the screen, and I'll show you how to tell the difference. Most of these mortar units have 2 sets of attacks, identified by the 2 attack costs in the upper left-hand corner of the counter. The top attack cost number represents direct attacks. Direct attacks require a target hex to be within that mortar unit's range and line of sight. If the mortar unit has a second number in parentheses below it, then this is the indirect attack cost. Indirect attacks allow a mortar unit to target hexes out of its line of sight. Now, let's look at some other differences in the layout of the mortar unit counter. You'll notice that there is a high explosive icon next to the attack ratings. The high explosive rating means that mortar attacks are resolved against a target's flank defense rating. Mortar units have the option of launching high explosives or smoke. We will talk about smoke later in this tutorial. Finally, let's talk about the main advantage of mortars, which is their increased range. Mortar units have a normal range from 10 to 18 hex spaces. However, this extreme range does come with a few drawbacks. Mortars launch explosives onto their targets in an arc. As a result, they have an offensive gap of 1 to 2 hex spaces at short range. But be aware, mortar teams, even though they're not outfitted for it, can still conduct close combat, but unfortunately at a -2 to their attack rating. Next, we're going to take a look at some examples between direct and indirect mortar attacks. Direct attacks follow the rules for a normal fire zone attack, as long as the target is not within its short-range dead zone. The attack is resolved using the normal combat equation. The target unit, the Panzer Grenadier, uses its flank defense rating of 11. Remember, high explosives are resolved against the target's flank defense. The mortar unit's attack rating of 3 is subtracted from this to come up with a hit number of 8. The attacking player then rolls 2 6-sided dice and must meet or beat the hit number to score a hit. Panzer Grenadiers are pretty tough though, and this time it's a miss. The Soviet mortar unit would then complete their turn by making a spent check. Now, let's reposition our units and take a look at an indirect mortar attack. Mortar units with an indirect attack ability come equipped with a spotter team. Spotter teams allow a mortar unit to extend their line of sight position by up to 2 hexes. Be aware though, the spotter team and the mortar unit must have a clear line of sight to one another for this to work. Historically, mortar units sent out spotter teams to direct their attacks. Spotters had to be relatively nearby to signal or call instructions to the mortar team, since very few teams had radios at that time. This spotter team rule emulates that historical reality. The mortar team is positioned behind a wooded hex, and therefore do not have any targets within their current line of sight. But by using the spotter team with improved line of sight, they can now reveal the German MG-34 or the Panzer Grenadiers as viable targets. There are some key notes to remember when conducting indirect mortar attacks. Remember, the spotter hex is only there as an extension of the mortar unit's line of sight. Range is calculated from the mortar unit, not the spotter team's hex. Also, hidden mortars making indirect attacks remain hidden if they are not in line of sight of any enemy units. So in our example here, if the mortar unit was hidden, it would not be revealed when it conducts its attack, because it is behind the wooded hexes and out of sight from the German units. Now, let's look at an example for an indirect mortar attack. This time, the Soviet mortar unit is positioned at normal elevation behind a level 2 hill. Across the board, their quarry, a Panzer Grenadier unit, has pulled back behind a wall of heavy smoke and a wood building. The wood building also has a blind spot they could duck behind if they needed to. However, they're feeling pretty safe in their current position. To solve this tactical problem, the Soviet mortar unit deploys their spotter team out 2 hexes to the top of the level 2 hill. From this vantage point, the spotter team can now see over the wood building and establish line of sight to the Panzer Grenadier unit. Since the target is at an acceptable range and within line of sight, the mortar unit conducts an indirect attack. Let's walk through the battle equation. The mortar attack is using a high explosive shell, therefore the Panzer Grenadier's flank defense rating of 11 is used. The Soviet mortar unit's attack rating is 3. However, they're attacking with line of sight from a high ground hex, therefore they receive a +1 to their attack rating for a total of 4. Subtracting the 4 from the 11 gives us a hit number of 7. The Soviet player then rolls 2 6-sided dice in an attempt to meet or beat the hit number of 7. The die result is an 8. The Panzer Grenadier unit is hit and must draw a hit marker. The Soviet player then must make a spent check with a total attack cost of 4. They then roll a 4 and the mortar unit becomes spent, but it was totally worth it. Now that we've covered mortars, let's move on to artillery. In Storms of Steel, artillery strikes are launched from far off the game board and take more time to coordinate and fire than a standard battlefield attack. The types of artillery and the game rounds they're available to fire is dictated by the mission. In this mission, off-board artillery strikes are planned at the beginning of round 1 and resolved at the beginning of round 2. These stages are captured in Step 8 and Step 9 of the pre-round sequence. These off-board artillery units, OB artillery for short, are represented by artillery weapon cards. Let's take a closer look at the artillery card for this mission. The top of this card shows the artillery icon, identifying it as an artillery unit, and next to this icon is the type of artillery unit. On the left side of the card is that artillery unit's attack rating versus soft and armored targets. Above this is the national emblem stating the owner. Artillery units can be loaded with 2 types of ammunition: high explosives or smoke. On the right side of the card is a hex grid that shows the explosive range of an attack. Along the bottom of the card is the weapon card ID and a high explosive icon. The icon is a reminder that high explosives always impact a target's flank defense. This icon also notes that targets with a red flank defense are susceptible to air bursts. Air bursts negate a unit's +2 defense rating bonus from a woods hex. Historically, when artillery shells hit dense tree cover, the shells would burst in the air, sending shell and tree fragments raining down upon soldiers, causing devastating damage. Next, let's learn how to plan and execute an off-board artillery strike. In this example, it is the pre-round sequence, and the German player notices a Soviet convoy is proceeding down a country road. The German player estimates the convoy's rate of travel and figures their approximate location at the beginning of the next round. To conduct an artillery strike at this location, a friendly unit on the battlefield is required to establish line of sight to the target hex and call in the coordinates for the strike. In Step 8 of the pre-round sequence, they secretly write down the hex space for an off-board artillery strike. Sometime later, both players have consecutively passed and ended the round. Then they proceed to the pre-round sequence for the next round. The Soviet convoy is now in perfect position, and in Step 9, the German player now declares to their opponent that they will resolve the off-board artillery strike they previously planned. To resolve the off-board artillery strike, or OBA, first the German player places the artillery marker on the target hex space. Second, the German player must now resolve a drift check by rolling a 6-sided die. The purpose of this dice roll is to see if the artillery shell drifts from the target. Therefore, the German player must achieve a die result equal to or greater than their drift check number. The drift check number for the Germans is 3. For the Soviets, it's 4. If the check succeeds, the OBA strike lands on target. If the drift check fails, the artillery marker will move from the target hex by a number of hexes equal to the failed die roll. In this example, the German player unfortunately rolls a 2. This results in the OBA strike missing and drifting 2 hexes from the target hex. The German player will then make a second die roll to see the direction the shot drifted in. The second die roll result is also a 2. This result is then mapped to the appropriate number on the artillery marker. These numbers tell the player which direction the shot drifted. The German player then moves the OB marker 2 hex spaces in that direction. In an unfortunate turn of events, not unlike a Roadrunner cartoon, the OBA shot drifts to the northeast and strikes their own German spotter. As you can see, off-board artillery strikes can be just as dangerous to your own units as the enemy. In the last step, the German player must now resolve the OBA strike against their own unit. If the shot had landed on target, the German player would resolve individual attacks against all units caught in the blast. Since this is a high explosive shell, the attack is resolved against the unit's flank defense. Therefore, the defense rating of 10 minus the attack rating of 7 means a hit number of 3. The German player must roll 2 6-sided dice, and if they meet or beat this number, they hit their own unit. Now, the embarrassed German player really doesn't want to send a valuable MG-34 unit straight to hell. So instead, he decides to spend 2 command action points to increase the hit number to 5. Remember, players can always spend up to 2 command action points to modify dice roll requirements. Then the German player, doubting they have any kind of luck left, rolls the dice. The roll is a 3, which is below 5, a miss. And thankfully, the Germans save their own unit from themselves. Now that the drama is over, let's have a smoke. Smoke is represented by double-sided markers with light smoke on one side and heavy smoke on the other. The primary purpose of smoke is to conceal units. Smoke can never cause damage to friendly or enemy units. Only specific units can deploy smoke markers to the battlefield. 8 cm and larger mortar units, all engineer units, tanks, and all artillery units. Smoke is deployed to the battlefield using a unit's attack action. The player completes the normal steps for the attack action using that particular unit. However, instead of firing, the player declares they will be deploying smoke. When smoke is deployed to the battlefield, the marker is always placed with the heavy side face up. A heavy smoke marker provides several modifiers. Units defending inside a hex with heavy smoke receive a +2 defense rating bonus. Those attacking in receive a -2 attack rating penalty. Line of sight is blocked for all elevations, and smoke negates all vehicle bonus moves. During Step 3 of the pre-round sequence, all heavy smoke markers are flipped to their light smoke side. Prior to this, any light smoke markers are removed from the battlefield. Units defending in a hex with light smoke only receive a +1 defense rating bonus, and units attacking in only receive a -1 attack rating penalty. Line of sight is not blocked by light smoke. However, there is a +1 defense rating for line of sight that passes through its hex, and line of sight is blocked for all elevations if it passes through 2 or more light smoke markers. Also note that stacked and adjacent smoke markers are limited to a cumulative +2 defense rating or a -2 attack rating modifier. As you can see, smoke can be very useful for laying down defensive lines of cover on the battlefield. With the rules we've covered in this tutorial, you are now ready to play missions 5 and 6. In the next episode of this series, we will continue to learn the remainder of the rules for Storms of Steel to allow you to play all missions. These rules will cover topics including vehicles, fortifications, obstacles, and special weapons like flamethrowers. So once you've mastered missions 5 and 6, check back to the Harsh Rules channel for more tutorials on these topics. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.